As part of staying dialed in to the book industry, one of the things that I regularly do is scour through these various groups for writers on the internet. And a term that I have seen pop up so much recently is the term vanity press. Now, oftentimes I see authors tossing this term around, but I don't often see people dig into what we mean when we say vanity press and why publishing with a vanity press is so bad. And that's why today I want to do a deep dive into what we mean by the term vanity press so you can make sure you don't make a choice you regret. Stay tuned. You've been writing your memoir, maybe even for years. You know your material, you know what it means. What's missing isn't the story, it's the structure. And that's why we started the Memoir Method Book Club. Every single month, Emily Thrash, a professional writer and editor, teaches you how to read like a writer by breaking down a published memoir and showing you what it's doing under the surface. Your first session is free. Head over to pageandpodium.com/book club to sign up. So today we are talking about vanity presses. And I will tell you, this is a long overdue episode for me. I have actually had it on my slate of recording ideas for probably a year or a year and a half. But I have tended to shy away from doing an episode on vanity presses because of all the terms, all the concepts in publishing. Vanity press is probably the most divisive and political. But just because things are divisive and political doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about them. And in fact, I often find the opposite is true, that when things are divisive and political, the best way to move forward is to actually invest in nuance, to actually start picking apart and doing deep dives into some of these concepts that are splitting us apart so that we can more accurately engage in conversation around them. And that's what I want to start us out with today. When we're talking about vanity presses, there is a lot more that is happening under the surface of this term than we typically tend to think about. And I want to just take a moment to pause and really give some thought into what we mean when we use this term vanity press. Now, I want to start out by giving you kind of a definition, although you will see that this is actually trickier than you might think. But usually when we are talking about vanity presses in today's conversation, we are typically going to be thinking about either a vanity press or a hybrid. Now, in both of these types of presses, the main component that usually gets brought forward in these conversations is that vanity and hybrid presses will both require you, the author, to pay upfront. Now, this is in pretty stark contrast to a traditional publisher, wherein the kind of definition of a traditional publisher is that the author submits the book, the manuscript is acquired, and then the traditional press not only pays for all of the production components, your design, your editing, and of course the actual production of the book, but they also are handling all of that. They're coordinating all of these different players that are involved. They're making sure that they have a team that really speaks to the mission and purpose of that press. And they really are thinking about their brand and how your book will either fit or not within the brand that they're trying to get across. So the distinction that happens here then is that we have kind of pay to play, as it's often talked about, with our vanity presses and our hybrids versus not paying to play with our traditionals. Well, if you have been in this world, if you have been following me for long, you know that it actually is not such a simple distinction. And that's almost always the case whenever we have a binary situation, right? Whenever it's either you pay or you don't pay, we start to get into a little bit of trouble. Now, I do want to be really, really clear here. When we are thinking about paying to publish your book, it is a really good idea to be thinking about why you would want to pay. One thing that I would never, ever encourage anyone do is to find a press out of desperation. From this point where you're like, oh my gosh, I've got to publish this now or never. Who will take my money? That kind of place is not really what we're talking about. But the distinction that I want to draw between how we normally think of a vanity press and how we would normally think of a hybrid is that typically we will think of a vanity press as accepting any manuscript that comes across their desk. So if you submit it and it is terrible, if you submit it and it has been all created by AI, if you submit it and somebody else wrote it, doesn't matter. The vanity press is taking it, they're publishing it, they're taking your money. They don't particularly care about the quality. Well, of course, none of us wants to work with anybody like that, right? A hybrid, on the other hand, really should and usually is set up really similar to a traditional. So Page and Podium is a hybrid, so I will use us kind of as an example here. I have 3 books of my own, and I've also worked with many authors who have published traditionally. My publications are all traditional. And when I went through the process of a traditional press, one thing that I loved about that process was the cohesiveness of the brand. It was so clear to me that when I chose the traditional presses that I worked with, I chose them because I really respected the work they were doing. Now, in some cases, this was because I thought, frankly, their cover designs are beautiful, and they are, and that is important to me. I wanted to make sure they had designers that knew what they were doing. But I also noticed that the editors I was going to be able to work with at those presses were deeply invested in the same types of politics that I am, in the same types of arguments that I wanted to make in those books. And those presses that I chose to work with were specifically speaking to my reader. So I knew if my book came out through one of those presses, readers would be able to kind of identify who I was, whether they would be interested in that book, not only by the book itself, but by my association with that publisher. So once I had come through that process a couple of times, I knew that if I was going to found a press, I wanted it to operate in very much that same way. And so Page and Podium does. We have a core team, some in-house, some contractors, but people that we use over and over and over again for designing, for editing, for making sure that the production is really high quality. All of the things that publishers do for books, we do, and the traditionals do. This is intentional, and in fact, you will find that most high quality, legitimate hybrid publishers, meaning non-scam companies, are going to be set up very similar to a traditional press, in that you're getting the cohesiveness of branding, you're getting the thoroughness of the editing, and you are even getting the selectivity of that press choosing to work with you or not only based on the quality, although yes, that's true, but also on the specific type of message you're putting forward. Now, this is not necessarily something that all presses do, but some do. With Page and Podium, we also are committed to making sure that your book is exceptionally good before it comes out. So we will sometimes, like some traditional publishers, take on a book that's not quite ready and then work with the author to make sure that the editing is top notch, that they're getting the revision that they need, that the message and the story are clear, all that jazz, all the things you want for your book. Like I said, that's not always true of hybrids. But what is always true of a legitimate, again, non-scam hybrid is that we always will have a particular way that we are looking at your book to determine whether it's a fit for us. Now, in Page and Podium's case, we mostly work with women. We mostly work with memoir, although we do publish nonfiction that comes from experiential wisdom, very similar to memoir. And we are interested in a particular type of politics, a particular type of commitment to equity, to justice, to bringing forward stories that often get buried. Well, this is the thing that really creates kind of a tension when we're thinking about hybrid versus vanity. Because as I said in the beginning of this video, typically when we're thinking of a vanity press, what we mean is a press that will publish anything that comes across its desk. Does not matter if it's quality, does not matter if it's even something that's been invested in by the author. They're going to publish it, no questions asked. Okay, so when we are thinking about hybrid, I want to be really clear that oftentimes when people talk about vanity, they are also talking about hybrid presses. Truly, I have gone into all of the Facebook groups, and one thing that I see so often is that when someone will ask in those groups about working with a hybrid, immediately someone will reply, If they're asking you to pay, it's a scam. And this brings me to the next point that I want to make, which is that I really find that this type of conversation between traditional and vanity, when those are the two options that are offered, very often is presented with the type of false binary, the black and white thinking that so plagues high achieving women, myself included. When we are leaning toward a perfectionist bent, when that is something that we are trying to work with in ourselves, we will very, very often be comforted. We'll find familiarity in dividing things into good and bad, right or wrong. That's what's happening with the traditional versus the vanity press. So let's kind of get into a little bit about what I mean by this being a false binary and what we need to take away from that fact. Now, within this discussion of the false binary, there are 2 points that I want to make. The first point I want to make is that when we are thinking about this binary between traditional and vanity, very, very often, this is framed as though traditionals will never charge you a dime and vanity presses are taking your money and it's a scam. This is so clearly a false binary. I know you can hear it even in the way I'm describing it, but I want to dig in a little bit because I do find that this is something that isn't discussed in our culture. Okay, so when we think about, do traditionals ever charge us? The first thing I want to say is that sometimes traditionals do. So I want to give as a very specific example, one that I lived through myself. My second book, Culturally Speaking, is very, very diagram heavy. Now in that book, I'm doing something that I knew was a little bit out there, but I thought it was really, really important. And that is that I'm thinking about how the sound of our voice, our spoken voice, how that kind of communicates things about us without us even necessarily realizing, and how very often the things it communicates about us are things that put us in either a better, more privileged position, or that more often create inequality among us and others around us. So when we're thinking about that, what I found was it's really, really difficult to think of the sound of our voice because we can't see it. We're such a visual culture, and it's really difficult for us to really nail down what we're hearing if we don't have any way to annotate it. So as part of that book, I had created maybe 15 or 20 diagrams that were kind of demonstrating what a voice might look like if we put it into musical notation. And one thing that you will find if you're publishing with any publisher is that when you're thinking about diagrams, graphs, images, all of these things are more expensive to produce. This is not only just in terms of the space taken up on the page, because of course books are priced per page in a lot of ways, but also in just the technical prowess of getting those laid out. It's more difficult for your interior design layout to have graphics in there. You've got to make sure that they are the correct dots per inch. In other words, the best resolution that you need to make sure the printing is good. And it's just one more component to check. So when I had submitted that manuscript, it went under contract. And one of the conversations that I had with my editor was she said, if you want all these diagrams in here, we need to talk about subvention. Now, this is an actual term in traditional publishing, but I hear it so infrequently. So let me tell you what subvention funding is. Subvention funding is when you effectively, as the author, either pay yourself or get some kind of grant funding or some other type of support to pay the publisher to be able to include the things that you want to include. Now, because I wanted all of those diagrams to be included, I needed to come up with around $2,000. Now, when you're talking about paying a publisher, that's not a terribly huge amount, and particularly at that time in history, wasn't a huge amount, but it's certainly not nothing. And it is certainly not the case that because that traditional publisher asked me to provide subvention funding, again, a term that exists in the traditional publishing landscape as a way to say the author is paying into the publishing process. But when we think about my second book having subvention funding as a requirement to include all those diagrams, I haven't met anybody that has said, oh, well, so did you go to a vanity press then? And you know what? If they wanted to, they can say that. But my point here is, it is not such a cut and dried distinction between paying your publisher or not. It is not such a neat and tidy line between traditional and what we like to call vanity. So that's the first point that I want to make. It is not so neat and tidy that you never have to pay a traditional, and if you have to pay, it's a scam. It's just simply not that cut and dried. The other point that I want to make kind of under this umbrella is that when you're thinking about publishing traditionally, it is not the case that no one is paying. In fact, you are still largely the person that is funding that production when you go with a traditional press. It's just that you don't pay up front. You pay as the book sells. But one thing that I have found is really, really underappreciated in the author kind of circles that I try to frequent and observe is that a lot of traditionals are not offering big, huge advances anymore. So what that means for you as the author is that it is very likely that your publisher will just never pay you anything. That happens a lot, actually. Maybe in a couple years you get a $100 check, $200 check, but this is not uncommon at all for traditionals. And at the same time, there are many self-published authors and many authors that publish with hybrid presses who sell millions of copies. With self-published authors, they are taking all of those royalty payments and putting them directly in their pocket. And with hybrid presses, usually authors are taking a much, much, much larger cut of those royalties. And again, putting them directly in their pocket. With a traditional, you may not make anything on your book. So as we think about this money, remember, you are paying in. You are paying in through the sales of those books. When you publish traditionally, very, very often, your royalty share will be 7.5% on the net. So after all of the printing expenses, after the distribution expenses, after all of the in-house sales team, after all the people are paid, you are getting 7.5% of the remaining money. That is so little money. And before folks say, well, I'm not publishing it for the money, I agree. And that's why I think we need to be a little more careful about drawing this line between traditional being an unpaid service, meaning that it matters more, and vanity or hybrid being paid, meaning it's not legit. You're paying either way. So, what does that mean? Well, the other point that I want to make under this false binary umbrella is that instead of thinking about, is this a vanity press or not, what is so much more useful is to think about what type of press is going to serve my needs. What type of press is going to want to work with this book, invest in it, and have the right team members and tools available to really serve what I'm trying to do. This might be a traditional, it might be a hybrid, it might be yourself. But when we start holding up this binary of traditional good paying bad, we really set ourselves up not to be able to make any of those gray area choices. Now, I want to bring this into a couple of examples that are outside the publishing world because I think it's going to bring it into a little bit better perspective. The first example that I want to give, way back in the day, I taught at a community college. Now, this community college had originally, as many community colleges are, been called a JUCO, or a junior college. This was, I think, such an important school. It was out in rural Kansas, and they served the entire regional area with basically all of their nurses, all of their advanced auto techs, and so many other really, really necessary jobs that this rural region really needed more people in those jobs. But you know what I found? Is that when I was out and about town, a certain population of people refused to call this institution a community college, insisted on calling it a JUCO, and sometimes they would even follow up that JUCO term with something like the high school on the hill. Now, obviously, this term JUCO in this context is meant to be derogatory. It is meant to imply that a community college is not as good an education as a major state university. Now, before you say, well, that's true, because I hear people say this all the time, I know many, many people that went through major four-year institutions, major state land grant institutions, and I know many people who went through community colleges and then went to a state land grant. It's very, very common. If you're in the academy, you meet all kinds of people with all kinds of backgrounds, and I was for over a decade. Well, one thing I can tell you is that people that went to community colleges, good community colleges, very often will say that the education they got as a community college student, particularly in the freshman and sophomore classes that community colleges specialize in, they felt their education was better at the community college in those courses than it would have been at the four-year. And you know what? They were probably right. A lot of the four-year state institutions, those lower level classes are taught by grad students. Whereas at a lot of community colleges, those are lifelong teachers. They are faculty that are invested in making sure their students are successful. They have more experience working with a larger diversity of students, and they usually really recognize the value of hands-on learning in a way that I find a lot of grad students have not quite captured. Well, so why are we calling the community college the high school on the hill? The answer I would propose is because it really comes down to who is setting the term. And oftentimes, what I find is that the people who are so committed to using that term junior college or JUCO are the people who are really invested in making sure that their own four-year degree matters more. Well, I can tell you that does not fit my politics. I want an inclusive world. I want education to be accessible to everyone. And I want people to choose the institution based on their wants and needs and personality. That is exactly the same as with traditional versus paid publishing. Exactly the same. When we are thinking about which one is more valuable, the answer is always which one will serve you better. Okay, so that's the first example I want to give. But the second example I want to give is also going to get to this idea of exclusivity that I find is really at the heart of the binary between traditional and vanity. So the idea here, again, is that Vanity Presses will take anything that comes across their desk. I've already mentioned this is not true of hybrid presses. And in fact, I think the number of actual vanity presses has actually gone down as the hybrid publishing model has come up. That's at least what I have observed. And hybrids are actually also selective. But they're not exclusive in the same way a traditional is, right? It's not the same sort of very, very intricate process of getting in front of a traditional and crossing your fingers and querying and querying and querying. That's not the same. The traditional is more exclusive. And one thing that we do as humans so well is decide that things that are more exclusive are better. It's not always true. The example I want to use is when you are buying a car. Now, what's the most expensive car in that lot? Let's say it's a Ferrari, right? Maybe you go and you're looking at cars and you're like, you know what? Only the best for my family. And you pick out the most expensive Ferrari because it's expensive, it's exclusive. Not everyone can afford it. Maybe you're the only one that you're gonna get that car, right? Well, I don't know what you're gonna do with your family of five because they're not gonna fit in there, right? And the point that I want to make is just because the Ferrari is more expensive, it is not a better car. You might be better served with a Suburban or a minivan. And that might be the best choice you can make. So when we buy a car, we don't tell ourselves, I have to get the most expensive car because otherwise I'm not a real driver. We tell ourselves, I need to get the car that will serve my life. And that segue is going to take me into this term, real. Because I find that this exclusivity with a traditional is very, very often used to decide who is a real author and who is not a real author. And y'all, this really, really burns my buns. I cannot handle it. Okay, so when we are thinking about the term vanity press, very often this is actually being held up as something that only unreal, only not talented authors have to do. Everybody else, the real authors, get the traditional deals, but the people that can't hack it, they go to the vanity press. Y'all, let's not do this anymore. So the way that I want to really talk about this, the way I want you to be thinking about this, is how do we think about the term vanity press in the first place? And I wanted to make 2 points here. The first point is, when we're thinking about real authorship being something that comes from a traditional press, it's really obvious who is invested in the term vanity press continuing to be the way that we talk about paying to publish. And the answer is the traditionals. Now, I've already mentioned this. There is this very, very strange kind of vibe around traditionals that kind of tells us that they don't care about money. They're not charging us, so they must not care about money. This is absolutely not true. Traditionals care very, very much about money. So that being the case, I think it's pretty obvious to see why traditionals would be so invested in really putting down anybody that's charging for their publishing services, right? Because the more okay it is, the more acceptable it is for authors to find a really good fit publisher, a publisher that is invested in them, that wants them to succeed, that wants to give them all the tools to get their message out. The more that's accessible simply by saving up and paying a press to do that for you, with you, the less traditionals are going to be any kind of demand by authors, right? The less really talented authors are going to jump through all the hoops of a traditional. So where does this term vanity press come from? Well, remember, it's not that long ago that the only way you could publish was a traditional. That is not that many decades back. Now, of course, we're in this world where you've got Kindle Direct Publishing, you've got Ingram Spark. There are lots of ways authors can get their ideas out. Didn't used to be the case. And what happened was we had traditionals, and then we had services that popped up saying, we can do the same things as traditionals, you'll just have to pay us up front. Well, I wonder why those are called vanity presses. It wasn't the presses that called them that. The traditionals are who decided that it was vanity for your story to get out without their approval. And who decided that the traditionals are who get to decide whether your story matters? I don't know. It's kind of a small, homogenous group to be tasked with deciding who the real authors are, whose stories matter, isn't it? So I think we need to question that term a bit. But the second point that I want to make under this idea of real authors or real publishing is that when we think about the term vanity, it has a very clear negative connotation, right? And the question I want to ask you is, why is it vanity to want to get your story out without having to jump through a bunch of white guy hoops? Because that is very literally what is happening with a traditional. Now, I certainly do not mean to imply that only white men work at traditional presses. But what I do mean to imply is that traditional presses have been deeply invested in the same types of injustice structures that we have all been rallying about over the last 15, 20 years and longer. So when we're thinking about who we give the authority to determine whether our story matters, I would argue that a traditional press is one of the worst choices you could make for that. I would argue that who gets to decide that your story matters, that it's valuable and important, is between you and your audience. And I'll tell you, I want my audience to be invested in my story over a traditional press any day of the week. The audience is what matters. The people you want to hear your story, they matter. The people who need your message, they matter. Traditionals are great. They can do a lot of great things for us, but they are not the end-all, be-all decider of whose story matters, and we should not allow them to be. So, again, I ask, why is it vanity to want to publish your story without having to jump through a bunch of white guy hoops? And the next time you hear a press called a vanity press, I want you to think about that. Why are we calling it that? And who benefits from that term? It's not authors. And that is the perfect segue into my last point, which is the language we use to describe our publishing options deeply, deeply matters. Now, I suspect if you are someone that has been subscribed to this channel, that you are somebody who listens every week, thank you. I suspect you are at least somewhat on the same page with me, that when we think about how we describe particular things, it has a major, major impact on how the world works. And I always pull this back to my very, very favorite James Baldwin quote. Now, James Baldwin says, explicitly, we write to change the world. And the point that I love that he makes so much is that the way we change the world is by changing the way people see the world. When we see the world differently, we want to show up in different ways. We want to support people in different ways. We want to make changes in different ways. And what he says is, when we change people's reality with words, we are very, very often changing the world. Words really matter. So when we're thinking about a vanity press, I want to liken that to some of the other kind of language wars that we have had in our culture recently, because I think it's the same. Now, when we think about this, the example that came to mind right away was the idea of right to work. Now, I am somebody that has been really deeply invested in labor activism. Both of my parents belonged to unions. I belonged to the Authors Guild. I belonged to the university professor version of that, the AAUP. I am deeply invested in unions. So, when I hear the term right to work, I really bristle at that. If you're not familiar with this term, right to work is simply a designation that happens in a lot of states where the workers cannot be compelled to join a union. Now, however you feel about that, the consequences of right to work laws mean that unions are ultimately weakened. Unions really only work when everybody is on board. But when we call it right to work, it's so difficult to disagree, right? Shouldn't we all have the right to work? Of course. In fact, when we say it like that, it even sounds kind of progressive, right? Well, it's not a particularly progressive stance. But when we allow this particular type of language to be the way that we describe unionization, there are very, very clear consequences for unions that we have seen over the past 50 or so years as this term right to work has come into prominence. I bring that example up because when we start to use these terms that are really meant to protect power, not clarity, when we start to use these terms for ourselves, we very often change the world for ourselves. And you know, my stance is the thing that matters about your publisher is that they serve your goals. That is what matters. That is all that matters. So, what I want is for everyone to stop using the term vanity press. If we mean a scam company, let's call it a scam company. We know what a scam is. A scam does not mean charging you for a service. A scam means charging you and then not providing the service. Let's use that term. If we mean a legitimate publishing company that is going to care for and invest in your book, but you are asked to share some of the investment up front, that's not a vanity press. There's no vanity to that. That's a hybrid press. It is a real designation. It is acknowledged by every single professional book publishing and writing organization. It is a valid and legitimate choice, and it is not a scam. And if you want to publish traditionally, you know what? I think that's great too. If that is an experience you want to have, I think you should have it. But the thing I want to stop us from doing is believing that if a traditional doesn't support our story, if they don't authorize our right to tell it, then that story doesn't matter. Because that is not true. And we have centuries of history to show us that the decisions that are often made in these very elite institutions, whether that is a traditional press, whether that is a major university, or something else, those decisions are hardly ever made to really benefit the people at the bottom of the totem pole. And I know authors, we don't want to think of ourselves as being at the bottom of the totem pole, but when you're publishing your first book, you very much are. So let's be thoughtful about the language we use. Let's use language that uplifts our own efforts rather than tells us that if we can't get a traditional, we must be losers. It's not true. There are many, many options for publishing your book, and this is part of the democratization of publishing. I know you're on board with that. I know you're on board with more people getting their voices and stories out. And guess what? When we use this term vanity press, we are directly undermining that very, very important effort. Okay, I hope that this has been helpful. Truly, my takeaway with all of these videos is just encourage you to get your story out, to get your message out, to make sure that you are enjoying that process, because through that enjoyment, you are going to end up with the best possible finished product. So go out there, tell your story, and find yourself a publishing partner that gets what you're trying to do, that is deeply invested in it, and that is serving the audience you want to reach. That's the long and short of it. Until then, I hope you're making excellent progress on your book. If I can help, please reach out. And otherwise, I can't wait to see what you come up with. Happy writing. You know that feeling when a book just hits you? Not because the story is wild, but because it's shaped so intentionally that it almost makes you rethink your own story. You finish that last page and think, how did they do that? The structure, the honesty, the clarity. There's something under the surface that you just can't put your finger on. And the reason is, unless someone shows you how memoirs actually work, it's hard to translate that inspiration into your own writing. And that's exactly why we created the Memoir Method Monthly Book Club. If you want to join Emily Thrash every single month to dig into an exemplary memoir and figure out what's happening under the surface, head over to pageandpodium.com/book club. Your first month is free, and we can't wait to welcome you to the group.